Very good morning from my side, and welcome to the topic today. We will talk about variable rate seeding of corn and sunflowers and the methods to identify the zones of different productivity in the fields. This is very much a question about precision agriculture and whether we can improve our management and by this improving yields by a more targeted application of seeds. When we go back into the development of precision agriculture, it has already, I think, about 4 decades of history. All the activities, research has started in the late 80s and then continued into the 90s. It was very much based on the knowledge that, of course, soils vary in the fields, and with variable soils in the fields, of course, we expect that we have difference in nutrient and water supply. And this difference in nutrient and water supply normally also contribute to differences in yield. So a kind of push came into the game of precision agriculture when the GPS signal became available. Again, that was the early 90s. And this allowed people really to position themselves in the fields. Then based on these coordinates from the GPS, they knew where they are. And of course, they can allocate the field, the soil properties, yields, and so on with the position. And of course, this was quite the beginning of managing field inputs or crop inputs in a more precise way, addressing the differences in the field with different application rates. This has started very much in US, this development, and they started very much with soil analysis, analyzing phosphorus, potassium, also the soil pH, and based on maps of different soil indices in the fields, they were able to apply these macronutrients in a variable rate, addressing the difference in soil supply for these nutrients. Nitrogen was a bit more difficult because there was nothing available, or no good soil analysis available to indicate the nitrogen availability from the soil at that time. Just to derive the optimum nitrogen rate based on the yield objective in the field was not good enough. And then in the mid-90s to the 2000 first decades in 2010, a lot of remote sensing has been developed to monitor the crop stands, to monitor the vegetation, and then derive the optimum nitrogen rate, but mainly based on crop sensing. And then during the last decade, a lot of information came from satellite images. So also the satellite images can provide similar information than on the ground sensing equipment. And these days, a lot of variable rate application maps are based on satellite images. But yeah, today is very much the question about what variable seeding rate in the field can contribute to yield and the increase of yield in the field. And the question I like to answer in my presentation today are the following ones. So the question would be, is there a field-specific yield gap which can be closed by specific seeding rates if we meet the optimum seed rate for different yield potentials within the field? That, of course, will lead to the question, what is the in-field variation of the yield potential, and what determines this variation? And then the next one would be, is there something like an economic optimum for different yield potentials when it comes to the seed rate in the field? So this is basically, these are basically the underlying principles and thought processes which can lead us anyway to the assessment of the question whether the use of variable seed rates in the field makes sense, or whether it's maybe too much effort for the goal or for the objective we like to pursue. But then, of course, I like to go through some methods to identify the zones of different productivity in the field. And then I like to share some results on trials which have been done with variable seed rates and look very much into the yield response to a variable seed rate of corn and sunflowers, as you have indicated, as crops which are of most interest for your area when you consider variable rate seeding. And then finally is a question in my conclusion, is it really worthwhile to adopt variable rate seeding in corn and sunflower? So it's very much a question, what do we need to invest and what kind of benefits and value can we get out of variable rate seeding in the field? It's quite obvious that it's obvious that the potential of the yield increase we can get with variable rate management depends very much on the variability of soil properties in the field. So the more variable the field is, the higher is the likelihood that we can gain something out of variable management. And therefore, I like to start with showing some results of the yield variability in the field, and then also to analyze a bit what kind of rank factors determine this variability. The yield mapping technology, which is in place for almost 3 decades already, show the in-field variability very nicely. Also, we know there are, of course, also some errors with this mapping, depending on the tool which is used to measure the yields during combine harvesting and so on. But in general, they give kind of very good indications what the variability of yield in the field is. So here you see maps, yield maps, which derive from data from the combine harvester. 2 fields, you see in a way a cornfield, and the colors indicate the different yield levels. So on this upper left-hand corner field, you see the cornfield, which is about 25 hectares when you look at the dimension, the scale here, 25 hectares. And within these 25 hectares, we see corn yields that are indicated by the color, the low yield in red, which is in order of magnitude of 3 to 4 tons. And there are areas in the field which where even about 15 tons have been harvested. So that's, of course, a clear indication that there's a lot of variability, and of course, a hypothesis that variable input to these different areas in the field could make a lot of sense, both for nutrients, pesticides, maybe even, and also seed rates. Soybean field on the lower left-hand side, similar kind of variation, of course. Yields in soybeans are much lower compared to corn, but you see, the pattern in the fields with high blue and low yields in 2019. The same field has been analyzed by satellite images. So in 2018 already, on the right-hand side, you see remote sensing pictures, and based on models and remote sensing, yield maps can be even generated before the harvest is done as a kind of forecast. And you can see that the zones of different color relate very much to zones of different yield potential. And of course, this different yield potential in corn, in this case, can be addressed with different inputs of seed fertilizers and pesticides, if you want. So this is a cornfield, and here we have one example from a sunflower field yield map. Again, the different colors indicate different yields in the field. The two maps on the left-hand side are generated as a kind of forecast based on satellite images. We see also the yield varies within the field, and also the forecast changes, of course, whether the satellite image comes from 2 months before harvest or just before harvest. So the closer it gets to the harvest, the more, let's say, accurate or similar it is to the final yield map assessed by the combine harvester. On the right-hand side, you see the combine harvester yield data. And in the sunflower field, this is in DC tons per hectare. The yield varied from about 1 ton up to 4 tons. And you see in our zones of high and zones of lower yielding areas. So the site-specific yields can be measured either by monitoring equipment on the combine harvester, or even based on satellite images during the growing cycle. And of course, we know that the yield patterns in the field can vary from year to year, depending on rainfall and maybe some other factors influencing the yield. And before we really can map zones of different productivity, we need to have a couple of years in a row with yield maps, being from combine harvester or from satellite image, to delineate really the different zones of potential different productivity. So we cannot rely on just 1 year. It needs to be a couple of years. And if the patterns of high and low yields and medium yields are the same statistically over, let's say, 1 or 2 rotations, then we can expect that this pattern in the field are kind of stable, and we can consider them as a kind of more homogeneous management zone with, let's say, different productivities in the different zones. So that would be the prerequisite to start with any kind of variable rate applications. As we know, the different yield potentials are driven by different factors influencing the yield. And in European conditions, the factors influencing the yield the most in most areas is the nitrogen supply and water supply. The yield, the nitrogen supply we can control very much, or to a certain extent, with our fertilizer management, and can even address differences in the field with variable rate nitrogen. But of course, the water supply is something which is not in our hands, unfortunately, or fortunately. There are different opinions about that. But we have to live with what we get either from rainfall or what the soil can store, and we need to make good use of this available water to produce highest potential yield. And making good use of it is, of course, aligning all the other inputs towards this kind of limiting factor, the water. So precipitation and rainfall in the fields are assumed to be kind of homogeneous. Of course, we cannot consider really different rainfall and precipitation at field margins compared to the center. So we consider rainfall as a kind of blanket input to the field. What varies in the field is very much the water holding capacity of the soil, and the water holding capacity of the soil, as you know, is very depends on the rooting depths, how deep the soil is, and how deep the roots can grow. And then this is also quite dependent on the soil texture and the pore size distribution, which determines very much the water holding capacity and to what extent the water is available. And organic matter also plays an important role for the water holding capacity. So I think it's very much really to watch the water supply and derive from, let's say, the capacity to supply water, the optimum rates of inputs. I think when it comes to other factors, we normally see a much weaker yield response, for instance, to soil pH, if there are no extremes in the field. Also at a kind of adequate, if we arrive at an adequate supply, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, we don't get a very strong yield response to that. They need to be there, but of course, the response to different rates is not very pronounced. Also microclimates along slopes or when it comes to exposition of field and so on, plays a role, but it's very difficult to deal with that. And also weeds, pests, and diseases, we normally get a weaker response compared to, let's say, nitrogen, and of course, the water. So therefore, I like to conclude very much that kind of optimum seeding rate for different areas in the field depends very much on the water availability. And this has also been confirmed by some research and trial work, which is shown in this slide. So we see the effect of seeding rate of corn and the water supply on the yield. So we have the grain yield on the y-axis and the planting density on the x-axis. And the different curves represent different sites, and the sites differ very much in the amount of water supply during the season. So what the water supply in each and every site and year was is given in this table. I don't like to go into any details here, but maybe if you're interested, you can have a look at it later. Basically, with these different sites and years show difference in the total available or total water supply to the site. And we can see that across these different trials, the total water supply, being it as what it has been stored in the soil, irrigated or rainfall, was within about 700 millimeters to 240 millimeters, quite a distinct difference between the water supply. And when we look at the response to different planting densities in thousands per hectare, you can see that the highest water supply has the highest, let's say, requirement for seed planting density to achieve the agronomic optimum yield. So we would go for about close to 100,000 plants per hectare. Then there's somehow lower water supply on this site, the second one, where the optimum is probably somewhere at about 70,000 plants. And then with lower water supply, the optimum of the planting density is going down. What is also kind of obvious that if we increase the planting density above the optimum, we are at a kind of plateau. That means the yield doesn't suffer if we increase it above the optimum. This is not so much the case for areas or sites where we have a kind of very limited water supply. Of course, this one is very extreme, with about 238 millimeters only. It can bear only a very, very low plant density. That's, of course, not applicable to your condition there. That's probably a very, very dry site, not yielding even 2 tons. So that's out of question. But also here, we are higher with our water supply, 350 to 400 millimeters. We see that the optimum plant density is, of course, significantly lower to the high yielding sites. But also, if we exceed the optimum, there's a decrease in yield because it's not sufficient water to support the crop. And then, of course, the grain setting and so on suffers the most. And even with a higher seed density, we get a reduction in yield. But basically, in a way, our hypothesis is right that if we have a higher yield potential, which is very much derived from, let's say, water supply and maybe some other soil fertility factors, we need to have a higher planting density, or vice versa, at low yields, a lower plant density to meet the economic optimum. And as we all know, to summarize it, again, a result very much from US here. And all the breeders, they give some recommendations what the optimum seed rate is to achieve a certain yield. And of course, the theory that with lower yields, we need a lower number of plants in the field to arrive at the economic optimum, has been confirmed by many research data. What we also see is that the slope is not very steep, so quite often we see kind of very flat response curves to the seeding rate, and this is something which is based on, let's say, the elasticity of the different yield components of a corn or even sunflower crop to respond to the supply of water and nutrients during the season. We know that a crop is able to control the number of seeds, number of heads and so on quite a lot, depending on what happens during the growing cycle. But of course, this kind of results are taken by breeders, and they give recommendations for seed rates for the different varieties. Here you can see the recommendation from KWS for their varieties, and the optimum seed number, planting density for different productivity zones. So if we are in a low zone, normally we go down to about 7 to 7.5 seeds plants per square meter, and to arrive at a very high productivity, the recommendation is in the order of magnitude of 9 to even 11 plants per square meter, or 110,000 per hectare. You see that also within one, let's say, productivity zones, there's variation. Of course, the variation depends very much on the phenotype of the variety, how it grows, the length and width of leaves, etc., and also how well they work with the available water, meaning in a way how water efficient the plant is. Also, it shows a bit that in a way how elastic or plastic, how elastic the response to different density is. Basically, in a way, the higher the seed rate is in a given productivity zone, the lower is the plasticity of the yield components, meaning that, for instance, a variety like Padrino with 9 seeds instead of the Atletas with 7.5 seeds is less able to compensate lower density with more seeds basically per plant produced. And this applies also for the other productivity zones. So there's also variation depending on the phenotype of the variety, as we all know. But basically, this gives us, in a way, from the breeders already an indication to what extent the seeding rate should vary within the field, depending on the productivity of the different areas in the field. Talking about the phenotypes and elasticity towards density, this trial results gives you some ideas how different yield components respond to the seed density. We have the density here on one side. They started with 6.5 plants per square meter up to 9.5. And we have the yield response. So 6.5 was too low, but at 8.5 plants per square meter, they arrived at the, let's say, the maximum yield. After 9.5, there was already a reduction in yield of half a ton. And when it comes to the components, of course, some varieties have the ability to change the rows in the crop, but the variability is kind of low there. The highest variability and in a way the response to the different plant density is the number of seeds in the crop, which is of course a product of in a way the rows and the seeds in the row. And very much the seeds in the row, we always, we quite often see that a crop is completely filled or not completely filled. This gives us a good indication about, in a way, to what extent really the yield potential has been achieved in the field. So, and then a very significant difference and response to the different densities is the number of seeds in the crop. And this determines very much then also the final yield. Also the harvest index, meaning in a way the percentage of grain dry matter compared to the total dry matter, is an indication how well in a way they respond to different densities and how well the optimum has been met. Of course, very high harvest index means that the crop has worked very well with the available water to produce grain instead of in a way having a lot of biomass and with a low share of grains. So this is something we don't want, and that's the reason why we don't like to exceed the optimum seed rate, because in a way if we have too many plants in the field, all the vegetative mass consumes water, but then later in the season, maybe the water is short and the corn crop or also the sunflower crop, in a way, cannot really set the grain, or in a way cannot really grow or fill all the grains. And then, of course, a high density crop stand suffers very much, and in a way doesn't manage to get the yield cannot make good use of the water and doesn't get the optimum yield in different areas of the field. So then the next question is, how do we identify zones of different productivity? I have mentioned already yield maps, soil maps, etc. So basically, we have more information of the fields than just that. But it's very important that in a way this kind of information becomes geocoded, means in a way associated with the coordinates where and areas where the different properties or yield potentials are. In general, I think we normally consider also grower knowledge about the yield history, the cropping history, and general productivity of the field as important input. But the question is always how we get this kind of, let's say, growers information geocoded. Of course, there are computer software available where growers can draw their own kind of zones of different productivity. Quite often in many countries, we have field-specific soil maps, texture maps of the soil, even maybe soil type maps, and based on these maps we can derive, of course, the water holding capacity and some soil fertility data, which can be also used to identify the zones of productivity. Then quite often the topography is very important, so it matters where the fields are, what is the exposition of a slope, and these kind of things. Also, the slope quite often says something about the organic matter. Quite often on the top of hills, for instance, we have low organic matter compared to, in a way, the depressions with high organic matter. And this, of course, also affects the drainage of the field quite a lot, and can be also considered for identifying the zones of different productivity. As I have mentioned, yield history based on either combined data or satellite data of multiple years are probably the easiest to assess data. And when we combine the information from different years, we will come to zones of more homogeneous productivity. And this is very much how it is done in many areas today, where they operate with site-specific inputs. So it's very much driven by yield data and satellite images of the normalized differentiated vegetation index. If you don't have any soil maps and like to know something about soil texture, and with this also the water content, maybe organic matter, I think there are devices to measure electrical conductivity in the soil. And the electric conductivity can be used as a kind of proxy for the water content, and then also it gives some indication about the water holding capacity of the soil. And as I have mentioned, remote imagery these days, where satellite data are either, let's say, cheap to buy in or even free of charge in some countries, can give very good indications about the vegetation over the season. Even and if we have images from bare soil, there are also some algorithm to derive, for instance, organic matter and so forth from these kind of satellite images. So information is there. The question and the effort is really to get this kind of information into a map. And there are, of course, software tools which can facilitate these kind of operations. There are many available, and there's a lot of talk about what should be used and what has and the pros and cons of the different systems. And I think it's very difficult to find really a way in this jungle of different software offers to get the mapping and the compilation of a recommendation map done. So I cannot help you with really giving you a recommendation which one should be used or is the best one. I think here you need to find your own way, or in a way follow consultants which are very familiar in this on this topic to identify what would be the most suitable one in your case. But basically, when we compile all this information, map it, evaluate it statistically, and what kind of software tool ever, then we will come finally to map on the right-hand side with different productivity zones. In this case, they have delineated just 3 different zones for one field. And this is very much based on yield data and also data of the electric conductivity of the soil in a 0 to 30 centimeter layer. And the yield data came in this case from basically from 3 years two maize crops and one soybean crops. And then we see, you know, the patterns of yield in the different years are not exactly the same, but we see kind of structure which shows some similar patterns year after year. Maybe in this maize crop is more diverse, but anyway, the soybean in 2013 and the maize crop in 2009, you see a very similar pattern. And this pattern, of course, we'll finally find also in the different management zones, which means in a way zones of different productivity, high, medium, or transition as they call it, and low management zone. Of course, yield varies from year to year depending on whether it has been a wet year or a dry year. Also, some other factors might influence yield, but what doesn't change too much is, in a way, really the electric conductivity in soil as a kind of proxy for water, and also in a way soil texture. And here we see kind of very pronounced differences in the electric conductivity. And it depends, of course, very much when the electric conductivity is measured in the field, because you can imagine that in summer when, you know, when the water is almost exploited, as water is in a way affecting the electric conductivity a lot. If it's dry everywhere, then the differences between, in a way, the water content in the soil is not so much visible anymore. But of course, when you do it, when it's done early in the spring, when the soil is just refilled, then it gives you a good indication about the overall water holding potential of the soil. This is just in 0 to 30 centimeter layer. Of course, that represents only part of it, but there are different systems, and there's a lot of development on systems for the electromagnetic conductivity measurement in the field. So here we have 4 different systems. I think the one which has been developed first was the EM38. It has to be, it has to touch the ground somehow, and it measures, in this case, only basically one layer, the 0 to 30 centimeters with the signal. Then there's another one, again, needs to operate in contact with the soil, give some information maybe for even deeper layers. Then there's this one, which has let's say more devices to measure the electric conductivity, but still touches the soil. And as I learned, there's a new one which is touchless. So in a way, it doesn't need to have contact with the soil and can measure the conductivity as a proxy for water in 4 different soil layers. So that's a kind of very valuable input to derive zones of different productivity in the field. How it looks like is shown on these maps from one field. You can see the electric conductivity, the soil sensing has been done in March, August, and October. And we see that kind of patterns stay over the growing cycle, but you see the variation in March compared to October is much higher because we have, let's say, more water available in the soil, and in October most of this, in a way, soil water is depleted, so we have less water left, and therefore the map looks a bit more homogeneous compared to the March map. But what you can see on the color, dark blue means a lot of high water content in the soil, light blue less water, And when it comes to the amount of water in the soil, that's indicated by this K here. So for instance, we have already in March soils which have, I think, in 1 cubic meter of soil, I think less than 100 millimeters or liters per cubic meter of soil. Whereas in a way in the soils which have probably a finer texture, we see water content of almost twice that much, something like 200 to 220 liters of water, which are available at the beginning of the growing season. And you can imagine that, of course, this difference in water supply can make quite a significant difference in the achievable yield on this part of the field, on this different, let's say, productivity zones in the field. So if we know it all, where we have these zones of different productivity, then it's not so much an issue in a way how we manage these zones. So based on the recommendation of the optimum inputs of seed, fertilizer, and so on, we can generate an application map with different rates. And this application map, or what we call a map prescription, needs to be downloaded on a controller on a tractor, which of course gives a signal to vary the rate depending on the position in the field, which has to come from a DGPS receiver, so that this one gives the unit the information where it operates. If the unit knows where it operates, it now it takes the optimum, the seed rate or fertilizer rate from the digital map given by the map, and then the controller controls the seed rate by the hydraulic motor or whatever, which determines the density seed rate applied to the position the system is on. And this can be done either on, let's say, all the seed boxes in a planter, or some have even the capability to change the rate across the seed boxes. So this is a system really to manage the variable rate, being it seed, being it fertilizer, pesticides, etc. So this is a kind of equipment which needs to be available for variable rate management in the field. And a software package which in a way deals with all the information, which compiles the application map, and of course ideally also which collects all the data in the field from the combine or from a satellite, and with using some algorithm to make it a kind of learning system over time, so that the variable rate application can improve by increasing the amount of information which is built into the system. As you can imagine, this is whatever software system is used and equipment is used, is a kind of lot of needs some technical skills to get it done and to optimize it. So this is the kind of input and the cost to the system, and because it's kind of very complex and there are complex systems nowadays, a couple of whatever breeders, fertilizer companies, and other companies provide systems to make it kind of smart and easy to derive application maps and then to download this application map on the system, on the controller in the tractor, and then having the capability to apply seeds and whatever on a very rate. As an example, and just as an example, you see here on the right side the system which is promoted by KWS for corn seeds. It's very much, the application map derives very much from satellite image from your fields. So you can get a satellite image from your field, and based on the satellite image of your field, now the system analyzes this information and compiles a map of the field with different productivity zones, whether there are low, medium, or high. And based on these productivity zones, the system will recommend a different for a given variety, as you can imagine from KWS, for different for a given variety, the optimum seed rate in the different areas of the field, depending on the productivity zones. As I say in their advert here, is that it's not only 1 year of satellite image. They have satellite image from a couple of years, and really to see what kind of patterns are really stable in the field. And as an analysis, they of course analyze different years and come up with a kind of more robust map of different seed rates for your field based on this image data, satellite image data from a couple of years. So I think, yeah, this, and some of them are even free of charge. So it's just that you need to register and log in. Some of these systems, they charge whatever per hectare, or yeah, per year, or kind of yeah, flat rate, whatever. So this is on offer from different companies. Sometimes even distribution, fertilizer distributors are part of this game and giving this kind of, or offering this kind of service. And of course, a kind of more, let's say, sophisticated approach you can get also from companies which gives this kind of consultancies and having maybe good experience with very rate applications. But the question is always, we have the information, maybe we have the system to use this information to compile an application map, and then to finally plant corn and sunflower with a seed rate which is optimum or ideal for different productivity zones. But then there's the question, what kind of yield response do we get out of this site-specific seeding? And this finally, of course, determines whether it's worthwhile to invest into this technology and also invest time to decide on the technology and then in a way to operate with this technology. And there are different results available. I will start with one which some experience from your country, Ukraine. You see the source if you are interested in more information of this company. It's called One Soil. There's a link. There's more information than what I just share here. And it shows the yield response of corn to variable seeding rates. Starting again from yield map. So in this field, yield varied from about 4 or 5 tons up to 10 tons. So the red to the green. And this company has done strip trials, so across these different zones of productivity. Has delineated 3 different zones, as we have seen before. Quite often, 3 zones will work. If the variability is even higher, maybe you can go even up to 5. But 3 zones are much easier to operate than with 5. And then across this, on this stripes, he applied different seeding rates, starting with 50,000 up to 75,000 for this field. And he got the yield response in zones of high productivity, means the green zones, the intermediate or moderate zones, the yellow dots here as a yield response, and the response to seed rates in the low yielding areas. And you can see that, starting with the low yielding area, there was hardly any difference in yield response compared to 50,000 and 75,000 plants per hectare. And kind of similar result for the intermediate productivity zone represented by the yellow dots here. So in conclusion, it says, yeah, it didn't really matter what the seed rate was in the low and moderate productivity zones. Of course, it shows that for the low productivity zones, of course, some seeds could be saved. So anyway, it's of course a potential for cost saving of seeds. So there's definitely a difference between 50 and 75,000, 25,000 seeds less per hectare is also money, which can be saved here. In the intermediate zone, hardly any difference. Again, it looks like that the low seeding rate in this case was already sufficient. And in the high yielding zones, we see that in a way increasing the density by whatever 5,000 plants per hectare, there was a yield increase of 0.2 to 0.4 tons per hectare. And if the seed rate was decreased too much by 50 to 50,000, so there was a decrease in yield of 0.2 to 0.7 tons per hectare. So in conclusion, it looks like, yeah, we can save something on low productivity zones. We can save some seeds, some costs there. And on the high productivity zones, it looks like we can gain some yield by increasing the seed rate to really achieve the maximum yield in the different zones. This one hasn't been analyzed for, let's say, the economic benefit and what it means in terms of additional income. But basically, the gains are not very high here. So it's always a question in a way what needs to be invested in order to get this kind of optimized seeding in the field to judge whether this is a kind of promising move towards increasing the yield in the farm. This was one site in US. This kind of research is more extensive. So we see here the results of site-specific seeding rates from 93 corn trials in Ohio, done from 2012 to 2016. And they managed the field either with site-specific optimum rates or with uniform optimum rates, so mean blanket application. And across these different trials, they got a response in terms of return to the seed in pounds per acre in this case, depending on the corn seeding rate. And you can see all the response curves of these 93 trials, and the dots indicate the economic optimum of the seed rate on the different sites. So you see a huge variation of the optimum from, let's say, less than 50,000 plants per hectare up to more than 100,000 to 110,000 plants per hectare to achieve the optimum yield level, or the optimum response to the seed rate. What we also see is that most of these response curves are quite flat. So the slope is not very pronounced here. So the optimum, to derive the optimum is very much a statistical analysis event. But if you have a very, let's say, flat response curve, that means that if the seed rate has deviated quite significantly from this optimum, the change in the income or the return on the invested seeds was not very significant, not very dramatic. And this shows that if we don't meet the optimum precisely, the return on our investment is not too much affected. And basically, when all these 93 trials were summarized, we see, of course, this kind of results also. So we compare the application rate of seeds either in a site-specific optimum management way with the uniform optimum rate. So in this 93 trials, on average, the saving of seeds were about 1,500 seeds with a site-specific application per hectare. And the yield has increased by 0.19 tons, 0.2 tons per hectare, from 12.76 tons to 12.95 tons. When it comes to the over return here, meaning what has been gained as additional yield and what has been saved on the seeds, we come to a figure of $1,684 in the site-specific economic optimum rate compared to $1,652 in the uniform rate. That means overall the benefit of site-specific variable rate seeding as an average was $32 per hectare in these Ohio trials. Of course, this is a kind of decent added value from this, or an additional income from this more differentiated management. But of course, we need to consider the cost for equipment and information to analyze data and all the information technology. And unfortunately, in a way, these costs were not given in this paper because it's very much research and they don't look at the cost so much. The question is unanswered really whether this is return on investment when we consider also the cost to compile the application map, the cost for the machinery, and the cost for the application. We have a similar picture with less total trials in Illinois, US, same paper, 2012 to 2016 with 32 corn trials. Because less trials, in a way, it's more visible in a way how the response curves to corn seeding rate look like. But basically, you know, it's the same kind of message. They are kind of very flat with few exceptions. For instance, there's one which in a way has a yield decrease if the seed rate has been exceeded, has been higher than the optimum. But more or less all the others are kind of very flat response curves. And the seed rate varied from about 65,000 to about 100,000 as an optimum in all these 32 trials. As a result, very similar. In this case, there were even, let's say, on average, some few seeds more required in the site-specific optimum management system. There was a yield increase, but it was quite modest, at 0.1 ton only on average. And that means the return to the seed and to the variable rate seeding was in this case only on average $8 per hectare in this case. So this has to pay for all the efforts required to get the variable seeding done in these Illinois fields on average. Of course, it can be for the individual sites fields, it can be quite different. But when we consider a change of management, I think it makes a lot of sense really to look into, let's say, the bigger data sets and in a way look at the average, because the average probably represents represents somehow more the reality than in a way just picking one side, one experience where it has been good, or maybe the other way around in a way where just one side, the variable seeding rate didn't perform at all, and in a way conclude that this is nothing which needs to be adopted. There are more data from the US and more, even more sophisticated trial. Again, we work with the field I have introduced earlier, the field with the 3 management zones. So the low yielding management zones, the transition or moderate, medium, intermediate zone, and the high management zone. Based on yield data from 2009 to 2012, so we see the statistics of these different zones as a kind of proof that within the different zones of different productivity, the variability was lower compared to the whole field. This applies to a large extent to the maize yield in 2009. So the high management zones, which seem to be a drier year compared to the 2012 years in the same field. So the yield is significantly lower. And in a dry year, it looks like that, obviously the water supply has affected the yield more substantially compared to a yield where probably they had good rainfall in 2012. So in a dry year, the variation was in a low productivity zone, 3.5 tons about, and in the high productivity zone, 5.1 tons. And let's say in a year with more rainfall, there was still a kind of difference, but it was less pronounced compared to a dry year. Even the low management zone has a bit higher yield compared to the intermediate or transition zone. But anyway, it seems like now the zones are properly have been properly identified, and then they started to do trials, strip trials in parts of the field in the years 2013. I think that's the upper 2014 and 2015, and across these parts of the field, they have applied in strips different seed rates, different plant populations, starting from 60 up to 140,000 plants in the field. In 2 years, 2013, 2014, they used the same part of the field. In 2015, they changed the field, so they choose a different part of the field with these strip trials. And the purpose of these strip trials is really to derive yield response trials from these different productivity zones and yield response towards different seed rates or different plant populations. And you can imagine, based on these kind of trials, you get a huge number of data points on the 3 different management zones. And these data points gives you, of course, the kind of yield response curve from these different management zones to different seed rates. And this is illustrated in the next slide. So as I said, we had the 2013, 2014, and 2015 trials. And here we have the response curves of the high productivity zone and the low productivity zones. We see that the average yield, indicated by this line, dotted line here, was different in the different years. So average yield was about 7.7 tons in 2013, and it was lower in the years after. It was about 1 ton less in 2015. And you see the green dots and red dots representing the different zones as a yield response to the different plant populations, starting with 30,000, very low, up to 90,000 plants per hectare. And based on this yield response data, you can calculate the average yield response in these 2 different productivity zones. You see the red line has a lower yield response compared to the green line, what is expected. But when we look at the optimum, the calculated optimum of seeds of plant density. The difference between, indicated by this arrow here, the difference in 2013 was not very substantial. There was even a trend that the optimum was a bit higher in the low management zones compared to the high management zones. In 2014, you see the optimum seed rate was exactly the same. And in 2015, the optimum seed rate was significantly lower in the low productivity zone compared to the high productivity zone. So in principle, the different seeding rates the crop can benefit from different seeding rate in different productivity zones, but the difference in the optimum in these different zones is not very pronounced. So, and this is again comes back to the plasticity of the yield components of even a corn crop, which if the seed rate is too, let's say, is a bit high on a low productivity zone, it will reduce the number of seeds per plant, and by this, it comes with arrives at a lower yield. But the effect of the seed rate as such is not very strong, as it is shown based on this trial results from corn. So to conclude on corn, yeah, we can get a kind of yield increase with variable seed rates, but when the increase in yield and basically the return we will get from this kind of technology is somehow modest, I would say. Let's have a look at sunflowers. There are, of course, much less trials on sunflowers because of the crop as such is not that as widespread as maize, and also it's quite often considered as a kind of lower input crop compared to corn, and therefore not too many trial data are available with variable seed rates in sunflower. Again, there is experience in Ukraine from this guy from One Soil, and he has tried variable seeding rate on a kind of farm research. On two fields, one field was irrigated, the other field was a dryland, or let's say rain-fed production system. And the irrigated field was 45 hectares, as you can see here, and the dryland field was even about 100 hectares, quite the size of fields you have in your country frequently. The base for the to derive a recommendation for variable seeding in this case was also a yield yield data. So based on yield data, different productivity zones have been delineated. As you can see, the green ones is the high productivity zone, the yellow moderate, and the red color indicates low productivity. So to check whether variable seed rate makes sense to address the different yield potential in these zones, they tried different seed rates in the different zones by overlaying strips of either let's say homogeneous seed rate across different productivity zones, or variable seed rates with a kind of inverse recommendation for the seed rates, meaning in the low productivity zones a high population has been established, and vice versa in high productivity zones a low population. And by this, you get a variation of seeding rates and to address the different productivity zones. And you can do the same as it has been shown from the US trials, yield response curve towards the different seed rates in the different productivity zones. The same on the dry land. And as a result of the sunflower trial, the conclusion is shown here in this table. So we see the different seeding rates for sunflower applied. In general, 40, 52, or 64,500 plants or seeds per hectare. And the response in the irrigated field towards the seed rates in a high productivity zone and a moderate and low productivity zone. And when we look at these different seed rates in the high productivity zones, there's hardly any difference in yield response towards the different seed rates. In conclusion, it would mean in a way the lowest seed rate would be the optimum, because of course the lowest seed rate would provide some benefits of cost saving. In the moderate zone, again, we don't see yield response here, and also in the low productivity zones, we had no real significant difference in yields as a response to the seeding rate. So basically, it means it's seeding rate specific to productivity zones hasn't contributed to a yield increase. The opportunity is there to, in a way, save on costs for the seeds by really analyzing what is really the optimum seed rate for this field, and then in a way, it could be applied as a kind of blanket application, the same rate in all productivity zones. I think on the dryland fields, surprisingly, we get more or less the same result, not really very significant differences and responses to different seeding rates. So it looks like the sunflower is even more capable in a way to react on different seeding rates with changing the yield components, meaning very much in a way the head size and in a way the number of seeds per head as a response to competition in the field by too high number of plants per square meter, for instance. So let me conclude on, in a way, site-specific seeding, and does it make sense to invest given what I have just shared on, let's say, the results from research available on variable seeding rate in corn and sunflower. So definitely heterogeneous fields comprise zones of different productivity. That's well known and is the potential to react on this variability. Zones of different productivity have different economic optimum seeding rates. That is confirmed and also very much represented by seed rate recommendations by breeders. However, because of the plasticity of corn and sunflower yield components, meaning reacting to the density with higher number of seeds per square meter produced, etc., the response to seeding rates deviating from the economic optimum is weak. So there's kind of flexibility And if we change the if we change the seed rate to higher or lower rates, the crop reacts on it, and response in yield is not always very significant. So the trials from US, Brazil, and Ukraine did not reveal a very substantial yield increase due to site-specific seeding rates. Therefore, investments in variable seeding technology need to be modest in order to expect a positive return on investment. I think variable seeding shouldn't be the first kind of precision farming technology to be implemented, because the benefits of variable rate nitrogen, for instance, are probably significantly higher and a more important driver for investments in variable rate technology. Typically, we see kind of yield responses in the order of magnitude of 3 to 5%, and quite often a substantial potential saving of the fertilizer demand. So this gives quite often a better payback than what we have just seen on variable seeding. So variable rate seeding could become profitable if the required infrastructure and equipment, meaning a software, people who can manage the software, and the equipment, GPS, controllers, and so on, is mainly paid by savings and yield effects of variable rate fertilizer, for instance, and or plant protection applications. So in general, I would recommend to start with variable technology and precision agriculture, more with fertilizers and maybe pesticides, than with variable seeding. If this technology is in place, then of course the variable seeding can be considered, and is probably an add-on which gives some additional kind of return to this technology. So this is my conclusion, and I leave it to discussions and comments, and would be interested to hear about your experience